Hello, I am Dante Ang, the President and CEO of the Manila Times. Welcome. We're pleased to have today Mr. Jaime FlorCruz, former CNN bureau chief in China, and today an author and an academic. Welcome, sir, to the Manila Times.
Good to be here.
Yes,
Thank you.
well, we're very proud to have you because not many Filipino journalists are actually successful, or at least we don't hear about them working for foreign media organizations. And you have an interesting story. You actually, as I understand, weren't planning on entering journalism. You sort of stumbled into it. But maybe I think we need to take a step back and talk about what brought you to China in the first place,
Yes.
where you started your career.
So about 50 years ago, I was, 18, 19 years old, a college student in Manila. At that time, 50 years ago, the first quarter storm, we call it.
Yes.
So I was part of that group of student activists, student leaders. I was at what used to be called the Philippine College of Commerce, which is now Polytechnic University of the Philippines, PUP.
Yeah.
And it was the hotbed of student activism at that time.
It still is, actually.
It still is, yeah. And so for that, I was the editor-in-chief of our college newspaper. I was the incoming vice president of student council. And outside the school, I was very active in the theater. I was a member of Samahang Kamanyang, a theater group. And because of that period, we were products of that student activism.
Right.
And I was a member of the College Editors Guild of the Philippines. I was the chair, the founding chair of the League of Editors for Democratic Society, LEADS. And in that capacity, I joined a group of 15-member Philippine youth delegation on a 3-week tour of China. This takes us back to August 1971.
3 weeks that turned into how many
12 years
12
in my
years
case.
in your case. Wow.
Yeah. So it was unplanned. I mean, the same way that my journalism career was not really planned.
Right.
I was interested in journalism as a student, a campus journalist, but I never imagined myself embarking on a journalistic career until I got to China. I was enrolled in an advertising career program.
I see.
So when we went to China, it was for 3 weeks. And then because of the timing, by
third quarter storm,
by quirk of fate, the week we got to China for this 3-week tour, there was this bombing incident in Plaza Miranda, which was made a reason to
declaring martial law.
Well, before martial law, it was suspension of the writ of habeas corpus.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
Which was followed by a series of arrests of leaders, student leaders like us and other politicians who opposed the Marcos government at that time. And so, for fear of getting arrested, had we gone back, we asked to stay and wait, not realizing that the wait, in my case, would take 12 years. Yes.
Our common friend and I were asking me about that edition of the Manila Times because he told me that your name was on the front page among the list of people that the police were looking for to arrest at that time. That's
it was a very difficult time because, imagine you plan for a 3-week tour and then suddenly you're told you can't go home. And the worst part is we didn't really know. I didn't know it was going to be 12 years.
Right.
It was maybe next week, and then maybe next month, and then maybe next year. Well, the next year, martial law was declared, 1972, September 1972. And then another year later, my Philippine passport expired. So I became stateless in China after that.
Wow. Now, tell me about your group that went to China, because I understand our president ambassador.
Yes,
he was Chito Santo Romana was among those stuck in China with you.
Yes. So we were a cross section or a motley group of youth leaders, student leaders, professionals, young professionals. So we had a young journalist from Manila Times, Ros Galang.
Rose Galang, yes.
Was one of the 15.
Oh, okay, all
yeah.
right.
We had a priest, a Benedictine priest, Carlos Tayag was with us.
Okay.
Dini Bocobo of La Salle, Chito of La Salle, UP Collegian editor Vic Manarang.
Okay.
So it was a select group of student leaders, women's activists as well,
Right.
college journalists, student council leaders. And the Chinese called us the Philippine Youth Delegation. The whole idea really was, it was a study group. It was to learn about China. I mean, why China? We were very curious about China, which, as you know, was shrouded in this mystery, very inaccessible.
Right.
It's kind of like North Korea now.
Right.
You know, very few people have visited and can go in North Korea. China was like that at that time. It was called Red China, di ba?
It's sort of hard to imagine today because it was so different when you were there.
It was very inaccessible, and very few people, very few groups were able to visit China, and that's why we went. We were young and curious and foolish, I guess.
It must have been fascinating to witness or have a front row seat in a transition where, as you said, you know, China was like North Korea is today, and then opening up, and you were there to report on it. I mean, how did you?
I was there first. I wasn't a reporter first. I was an exile. I couldn't leave China for many years, and to make better use of our time, our Chinese host told us, if you want to learn about China, you have to go to the countryside, just like our intellectuals. So we volunteered. We thought it was a romantic idea. So we worked on the farm for a year. Magtanim ay di biro pala. So it was a tough life, but we saw China up close. We saw it poor, we saw it backward. We saw it struggling, but at the same time united as one, very nationalistic, until Chairman Mao died. But before that, so I spent a year on the farm, a year in a fishing corporation, sailing in the seas for a year and a half until '74, when we heard that the colleges have reopened after the Cultural Revolution, so we said we better learn Chinese because it's going to be a long wait. So we decided to learn Chinese formally. I studied 2 years of Mandarin, and then after that, I still couldn't come home. So that's when I decided to enroll at Peking University in 1977. My book will focus on that period, the class of 1977, because it was a pivotal period. 1977, a year after Mao died, the year when Deng Xiaoping came back to power and started his reform and open door. The people who enrolled in universities, they got in for the first time through competitive exams. The national entrance exam. And many of them, millions of them, took the exam after having spent a few years on the farm, in the factories, in the army. And to many of them, it's the last bus they caught. It's like catching the last bus to turn their careers or their lives. You know? So the people who got in at that time were academically good, but also socially committed, very mature.
And turned out future leaders of China.
The Prime Minister of China is one of them. Many captains of industry, government and party leaders, army leaders were from that crop of graduates. And they became the kind of the shock troopers of Deng Xiaoping's reform, changing China, the first batch of lawyers, engineers, after the Cultural Revolution. So it was a very exciting time. I was very lucky to have studied at that time.
Right.
And so I did 4 years of Chinese history
Okay.
in Chinese
Wow.
at that time. I was one of the 3 foreigners
Wow.
in a class of Chinese.
Wow.
And looking back, I really was lucky to
Right.
have experienced that and to see China change
Right.
from the front line
Right.
over the years.
Wow. And then, how did you went from studying history to journalism? Because
Yes.
you I think you started with, was it Newsweek that you
Yes,
you started.
yes. So I was an accidental tourist. Then later I became an accidental journalist. When I was a senior at Peking University, I was just doing my thesis.
Yeah.
I had a lot of time. 1979 was the first time that China opened its door to the American news organizations.
Right.
So they have started to set up bureaus in Beijing. And many of them needed a bilingual person like me who knew the language but also knew Chinese and China.
Yeah.
Knew China and lots of... So through a friend, I applied and I was hired by Newsweek as a researcher, news assistant, we were called, for a pittance by their standard. But so I did twice a week. I would go downtown in the office and did clipping and filing.
Oh, you did the clip file.
Clipping and filing, yes. So I did that, and I said, why not? You know, I'm getting paid for reading newspapers that I want to read anyway.
Yeah.
So I was very happy. And then after several weeks, the bureau chief, Melinda Liu, who gave me that first job, she also covered the Philippines.
Okay.
She found out, she realized that actually I spoke Chinese, I could read Chinese, and I had a lot of friends, Chinese friends in school and outside. So she said,
well connected.
Forget about clipping and filing. Why don't you go out and find out what's going on, come back, and type out a memo.
Okay.
So I started doing that. And then my big break came when the trial of the Gang of Four, including Chairman Mao's widow, Jiang Qing, started. And it was a big news in China and overseas.
Yes.
But the bureau chief, the Newsweek bureau chief, was on a long vacation, Christmas vacation in the U.S. and she couldn't go back.
That was your break.
That was my break. Okay. So out of desperation, Newsweek sent me a cable. Please file on the ongoing trial. So for 2 weeks, I had my break. I had my tiny name in the bylines, and then they heard, oh, there's a Filipino in Beijing who can write, who can report. So after that, the editors in New York encouraged me to pitch stories.
I see.
And so I did my own after that. And then when I was about to graduate from Peking University, a year and a half later, I told Newsweek I need a full-time job.
Okay.
So Newsweek wanted me to wait for 6 months because they were going to change bureau chiefs.
I see.
So I knocked on Time's door and defected to Time. So Time hired me as a reporter.
Okay.
Initially as a local hire.
Right.
So I really had to prove my worth.
You started from the bottom. Talaga, right?
Yeah, and I was not an American citizen. I didn't have an Ivy League degree.
Right.
English was my second language.
Right.
So I really had to work doubly hard, and then I had to be lucky.
Right.
And so for 6 years, I worked as a local hire, and then I became a full-fledged Time Magazine reporter, and then 10 years later, I was made the bureau chief of Time.
Right. How did you transition from print to CNN? To
so after 16 years covering China for Time Magazine, I felt at that point that I had been there, done that.
Okay.
I felt like I was covering...
You needed a new challenge.
I was covering the same story.
Right.
We call them evergreen stories.
Right.
And I felt like I needed a change. So I applied and I was chosen as the Edward Murrow Press Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations.
Nice.
I was the first non-American to be chosen. They choose one a year.
Okay.
And when they chose me, they realized that I was not an American citizen. So they had to have a special meeting.
Redo the rules.
They had to redo the rules. So now it's open to anyone who works for a U.S. Organization.
I see.
So I spent a year in New York in 1999 to 2000, researching, but also mainly I used that to get to more familiar with America, with my audience, American audience, because I've never been to America.
Okay.
And I spoke in many universities.
Okay.
And then at the end of that fellowship, in late 2001, summer of 2001, I was approached by CNN, and they asked me if I'd be interested to go back to China for them. So I said, I haven't done TV in my whole life, and I never imagined myself doing TV. Says, no problem, we'll train you. So they put me through 6 sessions with a voice teacher in New York.
Oh wow! Okay.
And then they hired a retired ABC News reporter, and we did mock reporting for 2 days in DC.
Right.
And then I was asked to follow a CNN correspondent in New York for 1 day.
Okay.
And then they told me, okay, you can go. You go back to China now. You're ready. Of course, I wasn't ready.
Right.
Because, as you know, print and TV are very different.
Right.
And I learned TV while doing TV.
Right.
Luckily, the cameras did not show my knees knocking against each other. Yeah, it was a scary experience in the beginning, facing the camera. Of course, my theater experience in the Philippines helped.
See. Yeah.
Not being stage fright, dealing with stage fright. But still, it's a very different. My biggest shocking experience or realization of the difference between the two is when I first wrote my script for TV.
Okay.
So I didn't look at the video. I didn't.
Okay.
I was told, okay, this is the topic.
Right.
So
like you were the print journalist, you typed out a story.
I typed out a story. It read nicely. I gave it to the editor, and he said, this is nice, but we don't have a video to cover this line, and this line, and this line. So I took it back and rewrote. And I started to look at the video first, and write around the video. I also realized that for TV, you don't necessarily have to follow the inverted pyramid.
Yeah.
You don't have to start with the most important element of the story.
Right.
You start with the most arresting, dramatic video. They told me the first 10 seconds, if you cannot grab the attention of your audience, they will switch. They will reach out for the remote and zap you out. So they said the first few seconds is the most dramatic video, and then you segue to the why it's important. You answer the whys. But
who, what, when, where,
who, what, where. You can put it in the middle and the end. And then you reserve something short and nice for your kicker, for the ending. And the way one editor described it to me, it's like dining. You have starters, you have the main dish, and then you leave some for the dessert. So that the kicker will be something nice and quick and something to remember. Learning those tricks was difficult, but very interesting.
And you were successful because you were there 14 years
for CNN.
For CNN. So, but journalism has changed so much over the years.
Very much.
What are some of the notable things that you've noticed, maybe in good changes and bad changes?
Well, they're getting shorter and shorter. It's like also in print, right?
Yes.
Because we are told that our audiences don't have
The
as
attention
much
span.
attention span and time
Right.
to read through or listen through long
Right.
treatises or stories. So that's one. So over the years in my working for CNN, I kept being told, it's too long, it's too long.
Shorter.
So 3 minutes became 2.5, then 2 minutes, and even shorter. Of course, you can do documentaries and they can be longer, but the day-to-day thing was shorter. Also, it's kind of like when it leads, it bleeds, right? So dramatic stories, dramatic videos get more. But I think the bad thing, the bad change for me is that many of the stories are now click-driven, right?
Okay. Yes.
Clickbaiting. Because they can
Monetize.
quantify the audience, the eyeballs.
Right.
We are now being told that your headlines should be more attractive to attract more clicks.
Right.
I mean, on the one hand, it's good that you can quantify, right? And you can tell your advertisers, we reach so many millions of eyeballs a day.
Right.
But my problem is you should not be a slave to the numbers, right? Because there are certain stories that may not be popular but are important, and that we should tell the public, right? So the way headlines are done, the way we line up the stories, I think that's when we have that difficult choices.
Right. Well, do you think that that maybe because there's so much disruption now in our industry that sort of our traditional journalism values are being compromised?
Well, at least being challenged. I think that's the challenges that we across the board, the journalists, the whole world face. How do you survive? How do you adapt to this disruptive changes that technology has brought? How do you? But at the same time, we all thought the radio was gonna die when TV came, but the radio is still very strong, right? So maybe there's still life after death for print or for cable TV, but it's a matter of how we adapt, how we adapt to changes, and then how to understand better our audiences, especially the millennials, the young audiences. I think we need to find out what they really want, why they want it. On the one hand, we want to influence them. We want to grab their lapel and say, this is important, you should read this, you should listen to this. But at the same time, to do that well, I think we need to understand them first.
Well, speaking of millennials, and maybe even younger generations, what would you advise them if they're interested in following your footsteps and going into journalism, maybe in a more purposeful path, right? Because I remember when I went to journalism school, many of the things that we learned are obsolete today because of technology. But from your standpoint, maybe...
I think I still put premium on skills, writing skills.
Okay.
Analytical skills. I think it's important to be skeptical. Not cynical, but skeptical. You don't believe whatever, especially what the government says. You have to question them, their motive, their agenda, maybe political agenda or commercial agenda. And then finally, I think in the end, it's still the writing skills that is very important. It doesn't matter what medium you end up doing.
Whether it's print, TV, or radio, the writing skills is key.
And the way to do that is read, write. Revise, and learn from, a mentorship, I think, is very important. You can learn in schools like yours. Universities have good journalism schools. But in the end, mentorship can take different forms. An individual, or on your own, you just keep on reading. Read, and read widely.
Right.
I think I also would advise that they have specialties.
Okay.
In terms of medium, but also in terms of topics,
Subject matter.
Subject matter.
So you were the expert on China. That paid off for you.
Medicine,
Yeah.
law, labor,
Right.
because our industry is also, being diversified and stratified.
Right.
But you have to be generalist.
Right.
The base should be you're good to do anything, everything.
Right.
But while doing that, try to start on specializing on a topic or a sector.
And when speaking of reading, you're working on a book.
Yes.
Tell us about that. What is it about? And then when can we see it?
I realized writing a book is like I haven't given a birth to a child yet, but it's probably the closest to experiencing.
Thing you can imagine, okay.
So I've been working on this for several years.
Okay.
It's a memoir.
So it's about your life in China.
My life in China, how I got there, and then focus on my years as a student and why it's important. That period was important. I was gonna write about my experience as a journalist, but my publisher says that's another book.
Okay.
So I will focus more on my experience in China, but I've been rewriting it because my first draft was more of like writing for Time magazine.
Okay.
We were trained to keep a distance from your topic. You don't use I.
Right.
You don't put yourself in the story. But my publisher says, no.
They want you.
We don't want a reportage on China. We want your story.
Right.
So he said, I want you to put yourself in the story. Tell us what you think, what you felt, what you did. Emotion. So I'm struggling now to put my emotion into this book, and hopefully in a few more months I'll finish it.
Who's the publisher for it?
It's Earnshaw Books, which is a Hong Kong-based, focusing on China, specializing on China books.
Right.
So I'm working on it. I think it's shaping up well and probably better than the first draft because I'm putting my anecdotes in it, including my love affair in the first few years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you have time to scan the news still, or I wanted to ask you about the current events. I mean, the big news today is
that's my problem in finishing the book.
You're too distracted.
I'm too distracted by the news. So yes, I follow the news very closely.
Yeah.
I was supposed to fly back to Beijing later this month to resume my teaching at Peking University. I teach in journalism.
You're there 6 months out of the year.
Yeah, 6 months of the year.
Okay.
But it seems that I can't go back on time. I was told they're pushing back the opening of the semester by several weeks. So I think it's a serious epidemic.
Right.
I really feel bad for China, but I think the epidemic shows the good and the bad of the Chinese system.
Okay.
The bad thing is because it's authoritarian, it's top down. Sometimes maybe the decision making, especially in reporting about it, was delayed, waiting for the top to give the green light.
Right.
But the good thing, because it's top down, when they decide to do things,
it's quick.
They can do it quickly. Just as they had just finished in 8 days, I think, this new hospital with 1,000 beds. Another one is coming up later this week. So China, I think, has the ability to do what many countries can't do, like locking down. The whole cities, 16 cities, I think, have been 40 million or 50 million people.
And I'm surprised, Wuhan is about the size of Metro
11
Manila.
million, right. So probably only China
can do something
as draconian as that.
Right.
And it's tough for the people, but perhaps that's the only way to cut the transmission of the disease.
Well, putting your journalist hat on, what do you find to be good practices in covering this coronavirus? What do you when do you raise your eyebrow? Say, this is a little bit of clickbait, as you were saying earlier.
Well, there is the temptation of over dramatizing or exaggerating. On the one hand, we have to be careful. It's a serious epidemic, and people are anxious, and so it's natural. Everyone, including the journalists, are anxious. But at the same time, I think we have to rely on the experts and have them put this epidemic in perspective and in the context, including the issue of whether it makes sense that everyone is wearing a mask. People say that it's not. It doesn't have to be everyone.
Right.
I think the role of the media should be dig deep into why it happened, what should people do.
Right.
But at the same time, make sure that the context is clear.
Right.
Especially different countries, different perspectives, different set of problems and challenges. Right. On the one hand, we shouldn't be complacent. We should really protect the health and safety of our citizens, but we should also refrain from xenophobia, alarmist, to the point of being racist sometimes. I think we should be careful not to get into the trap of like blaming the Chinese as if they wanted to impose this on themselves.
Right. Do you think media played I know that is troubling, but do you think the media played a role in that xenophobic reaction? Do you think maybe in
sometimes
some of the
unintentionally? Yes, I think because we tend to jump on one topic and then it gets magnified. Right. But the key is, I think, the media, which is it's also doing that, which is to translate what the experts are saying into bites that are understandable to the layman.
This is what you're saying, that they grab the attention first.
Yeah, so we should help distinguish the myths or the false reporting from reality. Right. I think that's the role of the media now, is to inform. Right. Forewarn, but inform in a realistic way and not alarmist way. Right. I think it's being done in many countries now, and I think the Philippine media also has that role. Right.
Well, I don't think journalists are also exempt from that from that scare. I noticed that some journalists are also wearing from masks, and as we were discussing earlier, these are the ordinary masks that won't help anyway.
Well, when I was covering SARS epidemic in China 13 years ago, I had the same dilemma. Right. I worried about my family. Right. I worried about myself. Going to the epicenter of the epidemic. Right. It's natural. It's human. Right. But in the end, I think we have the role to help the public. Be informed smartly, without going into the alarmist mode.
Right. Well, speaking of SARS, do you see a difference in the way journalists covered that epidemic back then and the way we're covering the coronavirus today? I mean, have we learned our lessons? Are we doing better, or are we repeating the same mistakes, the alarmist practices that
I think we should have learned. I think we have learned some lesson from that. I mean, there are similarities, but we also are noting the differences. Okay. The thing is, this one will probably be more serious than SARS. It's less serious in terms of fatality. Right. It's less than 3%. Yeah. And in fact, more people die of ordinary influenza flu every year than from coronavirus. But we should also realize that the impact of this one on the economy, Chinese economy and world economy, will probably be much more than what SARS imposed on the economy. Why? Because China now, 13 years later, is bigger. It's a bigger economy. It has a bigger source, it's a big part of trade, tourism, and so if China suffers, the whole world suffers.
Right. I hate to use that analogy about sneezing in the rest of the world getting a cold.
Unfortunately,
that applies.
That applies. And in that sense, we should really wish China well, that they overcome this test, this crisis, because whatever happens in China will affect our lives here and the lives of the world.
Right. Correct me if I'm wrong. If I seem to remember, during the SARS crisis, I think China's GDP went down 2 points from 8% to 6%.
Right.
But as you said, China was not as intertwined and as big as it is today.
Exactly. And that's the difference this time.
Yeah.
That's the worrisome part. Everything, China is a big part of the chain, right? And so we hope that this won't linger too long, and that China can recover from it, because it will affect the global economy.
But speaking of China's place in the world today, I mean, I don't think there's no better person, except maybe your colleagues who were stuck in China with you, who also went into journalism, could probably give an accurate or a credible read on geopolitics with China, China's role in the middle of all that. How do you, looking forward? Of course, I mean, these things pass over time. But how do you see the geopolitics in the region? The Philippines and China, but of course that it's much bigger than just Philippines and China. How do you see the region with China dominating this part of the world and maybe the whole world?
Well, because China has risen from 20, 30 years ago, so it's a big player now. The U.S. is scared of China, and a lot of what's going on in our backyard is actually part of the U.S.-China rivalry. And because China is much bigger now and much stronger, we can expect that rivalry to intensify. And too bad for us, we cannot choose our neighbors, but we happen to be in China's backyard. And that's why we have to figure out how we can coexist with a giant like China, while we maintain strong ties with the U.S., with Japan, and with ASEAN neighbors, well, first, I think we Filipinos should really wake up to the realization that China has risen. China is big. China is, many Filipinos still think China is backward, that we are better than China in many ways, and we are, but we also should realize that China has leapfrogged from what it was 30 years ago on many issues, on many fields, including technology, innovation, from space technology, military technology, from the Huawei's, the 5G, they're here. China has arrived. And so we have to first realize that China will be big and will get bigger. The question is, how do we coexist with China with our contentious territorial claims, So I think that we are on the right track if we are pursuing what they call independent foreign policy. We need not be an appendage or ally of China. They don't expect us to be. Nor should we be an ally or an appendage of the
Of the
United
US,
States?
yeah.
So I think it's good to follow an independent foreign
Right.
policy and proceed from the reality and from the national interests
Right.
of the Philippines and the Filipinos.
Right.
It's work in progress because the China-US rivalry is work in progress, and many issues face both bilateral relations with China. But we should maintain cordial relations. We should benefit if we can, when we can, from such a relationship with China, including, infrastructure or telecommunications, whatever China can offer. Why not, right? But we should always proceed from our national interests.
Right.
And if it's good for our country, if it's good for the Filipinos, let's pursue this.
Forgive the simplistic question, but I think in what people may be thinking about, should we be afraid of China, the new power in the global stage?
Yeah. Well, we should not be afraid, but we should be alert, or we should. I think that the thing is, China is changing very fast. So my advice would be, let's understand China better. Meaning, let's know why China is doing certain things the way they do. Why? What's their national interest? What's their priority? And then, and only then, can we, I think,
Map out
our policy and how to coexist with China. Of course, China is huge, right? 1.4 billion. They have awesome military power. So in that sense, China is scary.
Okay.
Whether we like it or not. Because it's a big country and a lot of people, and now the economy has grown bigger and stronger, military is stronger, so it's natural to trigger concern or even fear, but sometimes fear should not be based on ignorance. In other words, if we know China better, we don't have to be fearful of China, and we should be able to figure out how to coexist and benefit from being a neighbor of China, while at the same time protecting our national interests.
What do you think is the biggest misconception from the Philippine perspective? What is our biggest misconception about China?
Well, first that China is rapaciously trying to occupy countries or invade countries in our imperialistic, expansionist. I don't think there is such a plan or a program or a conspiracy in Beijing to do that. I think that China has a lot of problems internally, including this epidemic that will keep them busy within their territory. But of course, a rising China is also work in progress, and I think the Chinese have yet to figure out themselves what it means to be a global power. So in a way, I think China needs time to figure that out. I often use the analogy that China now is like Yao Ming when he was 13 years old, or maybe 15.
Yao Ming, the NBA superstar.
Yeah, superstar, 7'6". But then who grew up very quickly when he was a teenager. So physically he was very big, but emotionally very awkward. Still 13 years old. So China in a way grew very fast, too fast, to the point that they have yet to figure out what it's like to be a giant. And sometimes I think they're awkward in the way they project their power. China is also trying to project its soft power. They realize that they're really doing poorly when it comes to public relations and projecting power. They should learn from South Korea or Japan.
Is it because they don't know journalism, or they don't have
know
a
journalism.
tradition of free press, maybe?
Maybe, and maybe they didn't care in the
Right.
past. But and so China, for all its efforts to project its soft power,
Right.
has not succeeded in doing so. And in the meantime, what comes through only is the hard power.
Right.
So military power.
Right.
That's what we see. That's what the pictures
Right.
show. You know, the big parades
Right.
and awesome military power that they have.
Right.
You know, the aircraft carrier.
Right.
And they've tried, you know, using the panda, soft power.
Right.
But they're very clumsy about projecting their soft power. So I think that unless and until they can do that, there is still this fear of China that they have to overcome.
I should ask you this, because you still stay there half the year. What is the Chinese biggest misconception about the Philippines?
Well, first, I think they really know very little about the Philippines.
Okay.
Second, if misconception that we are happy-go-lucky, we are so fortunate to have nice weather and endowed natural resources. We have nice beaches. People love to dance and sing, which are true, right? Mm-hmm. But that's kind of becomes stereotypical. Mm-hmm. Maybe they also think we're lazy because we have such a nice weather and we have siesta.
Do they see us as American puppets?
Yes, that's another common perception, that we are just appendage or puppets of the U.S. And we give them a lot of reasons sometimes
To think
that, because we used to be, you know, just following the U.S. policies. So yes, that's a source of misunderstanding between our two countries. We need to convince the Chinese that we do have an independent foreign policy.
Yeah. But I suppose the same criticism she had about the Chinese clumsy projection, can that be said about the way the Philippines is projecting itself to the Chinese?
To the Chinese? Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, part of that is we didn't really have robust exchanges with China until recent years, right? And much of that is tourism. I think we lack in public diplomacy, both sides.
Right.
I think the Chinese are not doing a good job in public diplomacy in the Philippines.
Right.
And that's why their trust rating among the Filipinos is very low.
Right.
Imagine, Japan has a higher trust rating than China, even though Japan invaded the Philippines and killed a lot of our countrymen, you know, and our children. Why? Because Japan has done very well in projecting its soft power in public diplomacy, and the Chinese have not done a good job. The same way in the Philippines, in China, I think the Filipinos, should also do a better job in projecting the image of the Philippines and the Filipinos, and that way we can have a healthier interaction.
I hope some of these discussions will be in your book when it comes out. When is it going to come out again? I'm sorry. What's the timetable?
I'm hoping by summer, by
summer,
June or August. Maybe August is a good time. That's the 49th year of
your trip
to China.
Your 3 week stay.
My 3 week
3 week stay in China.
That's right.
Wow. Well, there's so many more that I want to ask you about, but we're limited by time. Hopefully now that your trip's been delayed, maybe we can schedule maybe your next trip back to Manila.
Sure.
We'll ask you how the Chinese are recovering from the coronavirus and maybe some other topics. But I appreciate your time today.
Pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.
Share my views and experiences on China.
And let us know about the book. We look forward to reading that.
I'll do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.